Hey Flash Historian subscribers! Tonight, we wander into the smoky kitchens, crowded taverns, and muddy marketplaces of the Middle Ages to uncover a side of history that rarely makes it into the history books. Medieval comfort food. The quick bites, greasy treats, strange street snacks, and questionably cooked meals that kept ordinary people fed through long days of labor, war, and winter. Some of it would smell incredible. Some of it would probably send you running. But all of it tells a story about survival, hunger, and the surprisingly creative ways medieval people satisfied their cravings. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these quiet journeys into the past. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what the weather feels like outside your window tonight. It's always interesting to see how many viewers are watching my videos over all the world. Now, lower the lights, get comfortable, and imagine the distant crackle of a tavern fire, the sound of rain tapping against wooden shutters, and the scent of fresh bread mixing with smoke and spilled ale. By the High and Late Middle Ages, there were many urban centers in Britain and continental Europe where such conditions, as in ancient Rome, were also present. 13th century Cologne and Venice had around 50,000, while London was nearing the 25,000 mark in its smaller confines. However, studies of the city of Colchester, England, in the early 14th century show that only 3% of households that paid taxes had a kitchen. Many artisans, other workers, that and classes of the urban poor, such as impoverished widows, lived in single rooms, where there were no cooking facilities, not even a hearth. From wills that inventoried possessions, it is possible to gain a glimpse of the difficult circumstances in which they lived. The bequests of the poor women included only clothing and bedding, which means that they must have lived in inexpensive lodgings with neither furnishings nor cooking equipment. Langland's Piers Plowman notes that impecunious widows had to spend the little money they earned spinning on their rent, milk, and oatmeal. Coroners' rolls for convicted criminals reveal a similar picture. In 14th century London, murderers and other perpetrators of violent crime were listed as having no possessions, and in the rolls that still exist, only 7 criminals had kitchen utensils. What did people like these, living on society's margins, eat? The one commercial product that was cheap, readily available, and not immediately perishable, was bread, which formed the mainstay of their diet. Flour also formed the basis of a wide variety of prepared foods, most of which were sold hot, which means that they were meant for immediate consumption. Fast foods of the London of the late 13th and early 14th centuries containing wheat included pies, hot cakes, pancakes, wafers. Meat pies and pasties were especially adaptable for ease of carrying and consumption, much like today's Big Mac. So how do we know that poor people were the chief patrons of the fast food shops? Since these people were illiterate, they left no spending records. The answer is in the process of elimination. We do know the spending and eating habits of the wealthy, because they left detailed records, which indicates that they rarely used the cookshops. Their main commercially prepared expenditures were for bread, which everyone from all classes who lived in cities, purchased, and condiments like mustard. Additional evidence that the main patrons were the poor can be found in urban surveys of grain stocks, which show that 41% of the households had no grain at all on hand. Evidence can also be found in regulations such as in those enforced in London in 1350, which prevented greedy bakers from charging more than a penny to put the meat of a customer in a bread casing and bake it. Why did people with sufficient income comes to buy food, store it and cook it not use the cookshops and the fast food outlets of the time, as many in that position do today? There are some answers that are the same now as then. The cooks in these places were generally not well regarded. The common view of them was that they were dishonest and dirty. Both of these qualities affected the wholesomeness as well as the safety of the food. Norwich sources from the late 13th century indicate that cooks from a neighboring town made sausage and pudding from diseased pork that was not fit to eat. During the same period, cooks and pasty makers apparently warmed up pasties that were several days old and spoiling. York ordinances prohibited the sale of fresh meat kept for more than 24 hours or the sale of undercooked pasties or those with tainted meat, yet York cooks were successfully indicted for all of these practices. Other unsafe food practices included the production of pasties and meat pies from tainted rabbit, geese and offal, or to pass beef pasties off as venison. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the host of the Tabard Inn was infamous for the use of warmed-up pies and the presence of numerous flies in his establishment. A common saying in late medieval and early modern times was that God sends the meat, but the devil sends cooks. The wholesomeness and safety of food concern people today. Even with a much stronger state and enforcement of food safety practices, people know that dirty restaurant kitchens and use of unwholesome food still exist. But, then as now, the urban poor depended on such places for day-to-day sustenance. Then as now, fast and unwholesome food is available to those whose incomes or lack of them make their cost prohibitive. Medieval people, who lived alone with not even a hearth, often returned to their miserable quarters after a hard day out in the cold, at a time when the food markets were closed. They had to have something to eat. And the cook shop, often open well after midnight, with smells of savory pies and hot cakes, was it. In the crowded streets of a medieval town, there was one smell almost impossible to ignore. Warm pastry, dripping fat, roasted meat, and onions slowly cooking together over open flames. The scent drifted through muddy alleyways and busy marketplaces, curling between wooden houses and market carts, pulling hungry people toward it almost against their will. For a tired laborer finishing a long day hauling stone, or a traveler arriving cold and wet through the city gates, that smell meant one thing. Meat pasties. Long before modern fast food existed, medieval towns already had their own greasy comfort foods. And few were more popular than these thick little pastries stuffed with meat, herbs, and whatever ingredients a cook could afford that week. They were hot, portable, filling, and cheap enough for ordinary people to buy without emptying their pockets. In many ways, the meat pasty was medieval fast food. Street vendors sold them from wooden stalls crowded beside busy roads and noisy taverns. Bakers stacked them in rows beside fresh loaves of bread while smoke drifted from nearby ovens. Some vendors carried trays directly through crowded streets, shouting loudly over the noise of horses, merchants, and church bells. And honestly, medieval people needed food like this. Life for ordinary workers was physically exhausting. Most jobs demanded endless manual labor. Blacksmiths stood beside blazing furnaces all day. Dock workers unloaded ships by hand. Farmers spent hours bent over frozen soil or muddy fields. Construction workers hauled timber and stone without machines of any kind. By midday, hunger hit hard. A warm meat pasty packed with fat and protein could keep someone moving for hours. Inside the pastry crust, fillings varied wildly depending on wealth and location. Better taverns served pastries filled with beef, pork, butter, leeks, garlic, and imported spices like pepper or cloves. Poorer vendors relied on cheaper ingredients. Salted fish, onions, cabbage, animal fat, or tougher cuts of meat hidden beneath thick seasoning. Sometimes, customers genuinely had no idea what meat they were eating. Without refrigeration, preserving food was a constant struggle. Meat spoiled quickly, especially during warmer months. Bakers often used heavy spices and thick pastry crusts to hide unpleasant smells or questionable ingredients. Medieval cities did have food laws, and dishonest vendors could face punishment if caught selling rotten meat, but enforcement was inconsistent at best. Still, hungry people kept buying them. Because when winter winds cut through the streets and your stomach had been empty since sunrise, a hot pastry in your hands mattered more than perfect food safety. The crust itself was often much thicker than modern pastries. In fact, some medieval pasties were designed almost like edible containers. Hard outer shells protected the filling from dirt, rain, and filthy streets while travelers carried them across town. Wealthier people enjoyed softer crusts made with finer flour and butter, but ordinary street pasties could be dense enough to survive being dropped onto muddy stone roads. And medieval streets were filthy. Animals wandered freely through the city. Waste filled gutters. Smoke from cooking fires mixed with mud, sewage, and the smell of damp straw. Crowded markets overflowed with shouting merchants, barking dogs, spilled ale, and piles of vegetables lying beside butchered meat. In the middle of all that chaos, the smell of fresh pastry still managed to rise above everything else. Especially at night. As darkness settled over the town, taverns grew louder and warmer. Candles flickered against smoke-blackened walls while travelers crowded near fireplaces to escape the cold. Tankards of ale slammed onto wooden tables. Dice rolled across rough boards. Somewhere near the kitchen, another tray of meat pasties emerged from the oven. Hot. Greasy. Burnt around the edges. Perfect. For many ordinary people, meals like this were small moments of comfort in a difficult world. Most medieval diets were repetitive. Bread, cabbage, onions, pottage, and weak ale formed the foundation of daily survival. Meat could be expensive, especially for poorer families. So even a small pastry filled with seasoned meat felt satisfying. Almost luxurious. And despite the centuries separating us, the feeling itself is strangely familiar. Because the medieval meat pasty was more than just food. It was convenience food. Comfort food. Street food. Something grabbed quickly between long hours of work or eaten beside a tavern fire after sunset. The details may belong to the Middle Ages, but the habit feels completely modern. People still crowd around food stalls after exhausting days. They still crave greasy hot meals during cold weather. They still eat hurriedly while walking through noisy streets surrounded by strangers. Human nature changes far less than history sometimes suggests. And somewhere beneath the smoke of a medieval marketplace, with rain falling softly outside and the smell of baked pastry hanging in the cold air, someone probably stood beside a crowded food stall, took a bite of a steaming meat pasty, and for a brief moment, felt warm again. Candied fennel seeds were one of the strangest little luxuries of the medieval world. Tiny green seeds wrapped in layers of hardened sugar, served after enormous meals as both a sweet treat and a desperate attempt to convince everyone their breath no longer smelled like roasted onions and ale. They were small enough to fit in your palm, expensive enough to impress dinner guests, and hard enough to make you reconsider your relationship with chewing. In medieval Europe, fennel was everywhere. People grew it in monastery gardens, kitchen plots, and beside village homes. The plant smelled sweet and herbal, with a strong licorice-like flavor that lingered long after eating it. Some loved it immediately. Others tolerated it with the same expression people use today when trying artisanal toothpaste for the first time. But medieval people believed fennel was useful. Very useful. Doctors, monks, herbalists, and elderly relatives all agreed the seeds could help digestion, settle the stomach, freshen the breath, and possibly improve general health if consumed with enough confidence. After massive feasts full of greasy meats, thick bread, cheese, and gallons of ale, people were willing to believe almost anything that promised relief. That was where the sugar came in. Sugar in the Middle Ages was not ordinary. It was expensive, imported, and treated almost like medicine. Wealthy households locked it away carefully, and cooks handled it with the seriousness of royal treasure. If someone coated fennel seeds in sugar, they were taking a perfectly respectable herb and transforming it into edible wealth. Making candied fennel seeds was slow work. Cooks heated sugar syrup in large pans, then carefully rolled the tiny seeds around while adding thin layers over and over again. Each coating had to dry before the next one went on. Slowly the seeds built up glossy shells of hardened sweetness until they looked like little polished stones. Very dangerous polished stones. Because these things were hard. Not slightly crunchy, hard. Not stale biscuit, hard. Medieval candy existed on an entirely different level. Candied fennel seeds had the density of decorative gravel. You did not casually throw a handful into your mouth and start chewing recklessly unless you had absolute faith in your teeth and a strong relationship with suffering. People learned caution. The experienced diner approached carefully. One seed first. A gentle bite. A pause to see whether the tooth survived. Only then did you continue. Medieval snacking often felt less like eating and more like negotiating terms with fate. Still, nobles adored them. At grand feasts, servants carried trays of candied seeds after dinner while guests leaned back in heavy wooden chairs trying to recover from meals that contained entire birds stuffed inside other birds. Candied fennel seeds became the elegant final touch. A tiny sugary reward for surviving another evening of competitive overeating. And medieval feasts truly were excessive. Tables groaned beneath roasted pork, swan, goose, pies, sausages, stews, trenchers soaked in grease, sweet wines, and enough bread to feed a small army. Rich households believed generosity was measured by how physically uncomfortable your guests felt afterward. By the end of these meals, digestion became less of a bodily process and more of an emergency situation. Fennel seed supposedly helped with that. People believed they calmed bloating, soothed stomach pain, and encouraged digestion after rich food. Whether they truly worked or not almost didn't matter. Medieval medicine relied heavily on hope, herbs, and the phrase, "it might help." Candied fennel seeds checked all three boxes. They were also one of the few truly sweet things many people ever tasted. Modern people are surrounded by sugar constantly. Medieval people were not. Candy was rare. Desserts were simple. Most sweetness came from honey or fruit, and even that depended on the season. So biting into a sugar-coated fennel seed felt special. Children especially loved them, although some discovered the licorice flavor and immediately regretted their decisions. Imagine expecting pure candy and instead receiving an aggressive herbal blast strong enough to wake your ancestors. Not every medieval child recovered emotionally. Street vendors sold sugared seeds at fairs and festivals where crowds wandered between musicians, merchants, jugglers, and suspicious meat pies. Small candies were easier to carry than larger desserts, and fennel seeds lasted a long time without spoiling. Which was important in a world where refrigeration did not exist and food safety was often just prayer with extra steps. Of course, people didn't stop at fennel. Medieval cooks coated all sorts of things in sugar. Anise seeds, coriander, almonds, ginger, orange peel. If it stayed still long enough, somebody probably tried candying it. Wealthy cooks experimented constantly because elaborate food displayed status. A noble household wanted guests to leave impressed. Not just by the amount of food, but by its rarity and presentation. A simple bowl of candied seeds quietly announced that the family could afford imported sugar for decorative snacks. That mattered in medieval society. Even small luxuries became symbols of power. Spices from distant lands. Bright fabrics. Golden goblets. Sugared treats. Everything at a noble table existed partly to feed people and partly to remind them who had money. Meanwhile, peasants made simpler versions when possible. Honey-coated seeds sometimes appeared in ordinary homes where sugar was impossible to afford. These were rougher and stickier but still satisfying. Though if left sitting too long near the fire, they often fused together into one giant sugary lump capable of causing minor structural damage. Honey cakes frequently appeared alongside these snacks. Dense chewy cakes made from flour, water, and honey were common treats during festivals and holidays. Sometimes spices like cinnamon or cloves were added if the household had access to them. Dried fruits occasionally found their way inside too, assuming nobody had eaten them first. These cakes ranged dramatically in quality. Fresh honey cake could be delicious. Warm, fragrant, slightly sweet, filling enough to keep someone working all day. Old honey cake, however, became something else entirely. A heavy brick of determination and regret. Medieval bakers respected texture less than modern bakers do. But people appreciated sweetness wherever they found it. Especially during celebrations. Weddings, religious festivals, feast days, harvest gatherings. Candied seeds and honey cakes brought small moments of pleasure into lives that were usually hard, cold, and exhausting. And medieval life truly was exhausting. Most people worked constantly. Fields, workshops, kitchens, markets. Winters were brutal. Illness spread easily. Food shortages happened regularly. Luxuries were rare. So even tiny treats mattered more than we might expect today. A handful of sugared fennel seeds after supper could feel comforting. Fancy, even. There was also something deeply medieval about combining medicine and candy into one object. The Middle Ages loved blending the practical with the enjoyable. If something tasted sweet while also claiming to improve digestion, all the better. Physicians wrote about fennel often. Some believed it sharpened eyesight. Others claimed it balanced bodily humors. Monks grew it in monastery gardens beside sage, mint, and rosemary. Travelers carried seeds during journeys because they were easy to store and chew. At times, fennel almost sounded magical. Some even believed it protected against evil spirits or hidden poisons. Which feels slightly unfair to the fennel plant, considering it was already busy handling digestion and breath control. Over centuries, candied seeds spread throughout Europe. Different regions created their own versions with varying coatings, flavors, and colors. Italian confectioners became famous for polished sugar candies that looked almost jewel-like. Similar after-dinner seed candies still exist today in parts of Europe, the Middle East, and India. So the tradition never completely disappeared. Even now, after certain meals, restaurants still offer tiny sweets, herbal candies, or mint dishes near the exit. The instinct remains exactly the same as it was hundreds of years ago. People eat too much. People regret it slightly. People reach for something small and refreshing afterward. The medieval world simply solved that problem with hardened sugar pellets and astonishing confidence. And somewhere inside crowded stone castles, noisy taverns, smoky banquet halls, and candlelit dining rooms, bowls of candied fennel seeds continued appearing at the end of meals. Tiny little symbols of luxury, digestion, and questionable dental safety. Sweet. Herbal. Crunchy enough to frighten a blacksmith. The perfect medieval after-dinner snack. Honey cakes were the medieval answer to dessert, survival food, and occasionally home defense equipment. Long before frosted pastries or chocolate candies existed, people across Europe were baking dense slabs of honey-sweetened cake that could survive travel, harsh winters, and possibly direct impact from small farm animals. They were warm, sticky, chewy, and one of the few genuinely comforting treats available in a world where most meals tasted vaguely of smoke and exhaustion. For medieval people, sweetness was special. Sugar was expensive, rare, and mostly enjoyed by nobles who liked turning imported luxury ingredients into public displays of wealth. Honey, however, belonged to everyone lucky enough to have bees nearby and enough courage to collect their work without getting chased across a field in panic. That honey found its way into cakes baked for festivals, weddings, feast days, and quiet evenings when life briefly allowed something enjoyable. The cakes themselves were simple. Flour, water, honey, maybe spices if the household was feeling wealthy or trying to impress neighbors. The result was a sturdy, golden brown block of sweetness that could either melt pleasantly in your mouth or challenge your jaw to single combat depending on how long it had been sitting near the fire. But medieval people loved them. Because beneath all the toughness and sticky fingers, honey cakes tasted like celebration. Like warmth. Like those rare moments when life felt slightly softer than usual. Honey was the sweetener of the people. Assuming those people had bees, access to bees, or weren't afraid of climbing trees and getting stung directly in the face by a cloud of furious insects defending their tiny honey empire. In a world without processed sugar sitting casually on grocery store shelves, honey was precious. Not priceless exactly, but valuable enough that people treated it with respect. Beekeeping became important throughout medieval Europe. Monasteries kept hives. Farmers kept hives. Wealthy households kept hives. Bees produced honey, wax for candles, and occasionally panic when someone accidentally disturbed the hive while showing off. Honey appeared in drinks, sauces, medicines, and desserts. But nowhere did it feel more comforting than in honey cakes. The recipes were incredibly straightforward because medieval cooking generally preferred practicality over elegance. Flour formed the base. Water or milk loosened the mixture. Honey sweetened everything. Eggs appeared if chickens were cooperative and not currently hiding somewhere inconvenient. Butter occasionally joined the recipe if the household had extra dairy and an optimistic attitude toward luxury. Then everything got mixed together into a thick batter somewhere between bread dough and wet clay. The baking process itself depended heavily on experience because medieval ovens were less precision appliance and more large heated cave with consequences. Bakers judged temperatures by feel, smell, and whether standing too close caused immediate regret. Usually honey cakes baked after the daily bread finished. The remaining heat inside stone ovens slowly cooked the cakes while kitchens filled with the smell of warm honey and toasted grain. When done properly, the cakes emerged rich, chewy, and deeply satisfying. When done improperly, they emerged capable of stunning wildlife at short range. Texture varied wildly. Some honey cakes stayed soft near the center with crisp edges darkened by honey caramelizing in the heat. Others hardened into dense slabs requiring serious commitment and possibly upper body strength to slice properly. Medieval knives weren't always sharp either, so cutting a particularly stubborn honey cake could become a full household event. Someone held the cake. Someone sawed aggressively. Someone else quietly suggested maybe soaking it in ale first. Still, nobody complained much because sweet food was rare enough to feel genuinely exciting. Modern desserts are delicate. Medieval desserts were resilient. Honey cakes could survive long journeys, rough storage, cold weather, and children dropping them directly into dirt. Travelers carried them because they lasted for days. Soldiers packed them because they stayed edible longer than softer foods. Families baked them ahead of festivals because unlike cream pastries, honey cakes didn't collapse emotionally after a few hours. They were dependable. Which is probably the nicest thing anyone can say about medieval food. Spices transformed ordinary honey cakes into luxury items. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, or mace added warmth and complexity that immediately signaled wealth. Imported spices traveled enormous distances through trade routes stretching across continents, making even small amounts expensive. Adding cinnamon to a honey cake wasn't just baking. It was financial bragging. A heavily spiced cake could absolutely become local gossip. Medieval villages ran on rumor, and unusual food counted as important news. Did you hear the miller's wife used cloves? Cloves. 3 of them. My God. Dried fruits sometimes joined the mixture too. Raisins, chopped figs, dates, or currants added bursts of sweetness throughout the dense cakes. Assuming, of course, they hadn't already been eaten by children, stolen during storage, or quietly fermented into questionable homemade alcohol. Medieval kitchens involved constant negotiation between ingredients and temptation. Honey cakes appeared everywhere celebrations happened. Weddings especially loved them because they symbolized abundance and prosperity. A sweet cake made with valuable honey suggested good fortune for the future, though realistically it mostly guaranteed sticky fingers for everyone involved. Feast days brought enormous trays of cakes to long wooden tables crowded with guests eating roasted meat, thick stew, bread, and cheese while dogs wandered underneath searching for opportunities. Honey cakes fit perfectly into medieval feasting culture because they were sturdy enough to survive chaos. And medieval feasts were chaotic. People ate loudly. Ale spilled constantly. Someone always argued near the fire. Musicians played badly in corners. Children ran through crowded halls carrying food they absolutely should not have been trusted with. In that environment, delicate pastries would never survive. Honey cakes endured. They could be stacked, transported, sliced roughly, wrapped in cloth, and eaten days later with almost no loss in quality. In fact, some actually improved slightly over time as the flavors settled together. Others simply became harder. There was often very little middle ground. Some cakes became so dense they bordered on legendary. A properly aged honey cake could require alarming force to bite through. Medieval people probably developed stronger jaws simply through repeated exposure. Eating one became an experience. First came the scent of honey and spice. Then the sticky texture coating your fingers immediately. Then the chew itself, slow and heavy, like wrestling sweetness into submission. It wasn't soft cake by modern standards. It was durable cake. Practical cake. Cake that understood medieval life was difficult and adapted accordingly. Yet despite their toughness, people genuinely loved them. Because honey cakes represented comfort in a harsh world. Most medieval diets relied heavily on bread, porridge, cabbage, onions, and whatever protein happened to be available. Winters were long. Food shortages happened regularly. Luxuries disappeared quickly. But a honey cake felt special. Warm from the oven on a cold evening. Shared during festivals. Given as gifts. Packed for journeys. Served at weddings. Broken apart beside fires while snow pressed against windows. Even small sweetness mattered enormously. Sometimes honey cakes became gifts or bribes. Offering someone a well-made cake could strengthen friendships, smooth arguments, or encourage generosity. Please accept this honey cake and forget I accidentally let my goat destroy your fence. The passive-aggressive potential was endless too. A badly made honey cake could send messages without words. Oh, thank you for inviting us. Of course. Enjoy the cake. Why is it so heavy? No reason. Medieval hospitality carried risks. Monasteries baked their own versions as well. Monks often kept bees for wax candles and honey production, meaning monastery kitchens regularly experimented with honey-based foods. Some recipes included herbs or nuts. Others stayed extremely plain. Even plain versions remained comforting because honey itself carried warmth and richness impossible to ignore. Children especially loved honey cakes because sweet foods were so uncommon. A thick slice during a festival probably felt magical. Sticky fingers, crumbs everywhere, chewing endlessly while adults talked nearby. Though children also discovered quickly that eating too much honey cake too fast produced consequences. Dense medieval desserts demanded patience. Travelers carried honey cakes on roads because they lasted remarkably well. Merchants, pilgrims, and messengers tucked them into bags beside bread and dried meat. A cake tough enough to survive bouncing around in a cart for days became extremely practical. And practical food mattered. Because medieval travel was exhausting. Roads turned muddy constantly. Inns varied from welcoming to deeply concerning. Rain ruined softer foods quickly. Honey cakes stayed reliable through almost everything except perhaps direct contact with watermills. Even then they might survive. Over time, honey cake traditions evolved into later gingerbreads, spice cakes, and festive breads across Europe. Many modern holiday desserts still carry traces of those old medieval recipes buried beneath softer textures and dramatically improved baking techniques. But at their heart, honey cakes remain wonderfully medieval. Simple ingredients. Heavy texture. Sticky sweetness. Enough durability to survive accidental misuse. A dessert designed not for elegance, but endurance. And somewhere inside smoky medieval kitchens filled with crackling fires, flour-covered tables, buzzing flies, and exhausted bakers wiping honey from their hands, trays of golden cakes continued sliding from ovens. Dense. Warm. Sweet enough to make winter feel briefly survivable. Eel pie was the kind of food only medieval people could invent with complete confidence. Somewhere along the muddy banks of a river, a cook stared at a long, slippery eel flopping violently in a bucket and thought, you know what this needs? Pastry. And somehow, against all odds, the idea survived for centuries. At first glance, eels did not inspire culinary trust. They looked less like fish and more like animated ropes possessed by deep personal anger. Smooth, muscular, endlessly wriggling, and coated in enough slime to make handling them feel like a punishment from God, eels were deeply unsettling creatures. They twisted out of hands, escaped baskets, and had an almost supernatural talent for flinging themselves directly toward the nearest patch of mud the moment someone tried to grab them. But medieval people didn't care about appearances. If something was edible, plentiful, and easier to catch than a deer, it immediately became dinner. And eels were everywhere. Rivers across Europe once swarmed with them. In England especially, the Thames and surrounding waterways carried enormous eel populations. Villagers trapped them by the thousands. Fishermen hauled them up in nets. Markets sold them fresh, smoked, salted, and occasionally still trying to escape. Some landlords even accepted rent payments in eels because there were simply that many around. Imagine paying taxes with slippery fish snakes. That was medieval life. Eels mattered because they were reliable. Other meats could become expensive or difficult to find during harsh winters or poor harvests, but eels remained available in rivers, marshes, and coastal waters. Monasteries loved them because church fasting rules often restricted red meat while allowing fish. And medieval people classified eels as fish despite the fact they looked suspiciously like something lurking in cursed water waiting to drag travelers into swamps. Religious loopholes are powerful things. Once caught, the eels headed for kitchens where cooks faced the deeply unpleasant task of preparing them. Cleaning eels was not graceful work. First came the struggle of holding on to them. An eel fresh from the river possessed the raw determination of an athlete escaping capture. They whipped across tables, slid through fingers, and coated everything in slime. Medieval cooks probably developed grip strength capable of crushing apples simply through repeated battles with seafood. Then came skinning. And medieval skinning techniques were horrifyingly direct. Some cooks nailed eel heads to wooden boards before pulling the skin downward with pliers or bare hands. Others used ash or salt to reduce slipperiness. None of these methods made the process dignified for anyone involved. Eventually, though, the eel became food. The meat itself was rich, fatty, and surprisingly filling. Unlike lighter white fish, eel carried a dense texture almost closer to meat than seafood. When cooked slowly, it became tender and flavorful, perfect for heavy medieval dishes designed to keep people full through long days of labor and freezing nights. Naturally, somebody decided to bake it into a pie. Medieval pies were not delicate pastries. They were fortifications. Modern pies are soft, flaky, and carefully balanced. Medieval pies looked like they could survive military conflict. Their crusts were thick enough to protect fillings during transport, preserve food longer, and possibly stop small projectiles if held correctly. The pastry wasn't always intended to be eaten either. Some pie crusts existed mainly as cooking containers called coffins, thick shells built to hold meat and broth while baking. Wealthier households used finer flour for edible crusts, but poorer kitchens often produced pies sturdy enough to function as temporary construction material. Inside these heavy pastry walls went chopped eel meat mixed with onions, herbs, broth, and spices if available. The onions mattered enormously because medieval cooking loved onions with frightening dedication. Everything contained onions. Stews, pies, roasted dishes, sauces. Entire kitchens probably smelled permanently of onion no matter what was cooking. Herbs like parsley, sage, or thyme might be added for flavor. Wealthier cooks included pepper, cloves, or nutmeg imported through expensive trade routes stretching across continents. A heavily spiced eel pie quietly announced financial success to everyone at the table. Observe. We flavored swamp fish with imported pepper. True luxury. Then came the baking. Pies baked near roaring hearth fires or inside large communal ovens already heated from bread making earlier in the day. Slowly the eel released fat and juices into the filling while the crust hardened into golden armor around it. The smell was memorable. Not necessarily bad, but strong. Rich fish oil, onions, herbs, hot pastry, river scent. Medieval kitchens already contained smoke, damp clothing, boiling stew, ale, wet dogs, and dozens of humans packed into enclosed spaces. Adding eel pie to that environment created an atmosphere less like fine dining and more like survival with seasoning. Still, people genuinely loved it. Because eel pie filled stomachs effectively. Medieval life demanded calories constantly. Most people worked physically exhausting jobs from sunrise to sunset. Farmers, blacksmiths, fishermen, servants, laborers. Food wasn't about elegance. It was fuel. Heavy pies packed with fatty eel provided serious energy. And unlike more expensive meats, eel remained affordable for ordinary people in many regions. Coastal towns especially built entire local food cultures around seafood and river catches. Waste was unacceptable. Every edible creature had value. Which explains why medieval cuisine sometimes reads like a list of dares. But eel pie wasn't merely desperation food. In some places, it became genuinely respected. Special recipes appeared for feast days. Taverns served hot slices beside ale. Street vendors sold portable pies to workers and travelers needing quick meals. Portable food mattered enormously in the medieval world. Travel was exhausting, roads were terrible, and inns varied wildly in quality. A sturdy pie carried easily and survived rough journeys remarkably well. Even after cooling, the dense filling stayed satisfying. Unless the crust became too hard. This happened frequently. Some medieval pies aged into near geological formations after a few days. Travelers likely developed strategies involving soaking pie crusts in ale before attempting to chew them. Teeth were valuable and not easily replaced. Children probably treated leftover crusts as toys before eventually feeding them to pigs. Eel pie also thrived because medieval Europe experienced countless religious fasting days where fish replaced meat. The church calendar restricted eating habits constantly. During Lent and other fasting periods, households needed alternatives to pork or beef. Eels counted as acceptable. Some monasteries became especially famous for eel dishes. Monks raised fish in ponds, trapped eels locally, and developed recipes refined over generations. Which feels oddly comforting somehow. Quiet monks carefully perfecting swampfish pastry while copying manuscripts by candlelight. Though monastery kitchens were likely far louder and greasier than modern imagination prefers. Markets selling eels were chaotic places. Buckets full of live eels twisted together like living rope while vendors shouted prices over crowds. Fish scales glittered on tables. Water sloshed everywhere. Cats lurked nearby waiting for opportunities. And inevitably, some eel escaped. Probably several. Somewhere in medieval Europe, there was almost certainly a cook chasing a runaway eel across muddy streets while neighbors pretended not to stare. The social classes ate eel pie differently too. Poorer households made simple versions with minimal seasoning and rough flour crusts. Wealthier kitchens produced elaborate pies decorated with pastry shapes, expensive spices, and richer fillings. Some banquet pies became enormous centerpieces carried dramatically into halls during feasts. Because medieval nobles believed every meal should resemble theater. At large feasts, guests consumed astonishing quantities of food. Roasted birds, trenchers soaked in stew, cheeses, custards, breads, wines, and pies of every imaginable variety crowded long tables while musicians played and servants rushed endlessly between benches. Eel pie fit perfectly into that world. Rich enough to satisfy. Sturdy enough to survive chaos. Strange enough to feel distinctly medieval. And despite sounding bizarre today, eel dishes survived for centuries. Even much later, eel pies remained popular in parts of England alongside jellied eels and other traditional river foods. Entire local identities formed around them. Modern audiences often react to eel pie with horror mostly because people today are disconnected from older food traditions. Medieval people, meanwhile, would probably look at modern processed snacks with equal suspicion. You eat bright orange powder willingly? Fair point honestly. Because beneath the strange appearance and slippery origins, eel pie represented something practical and deeply human. People using available ingredients creatively. Turning difficult environments into meals. Finding ways to make ordinary food filling, portable, and comforting. Even if that comfort came wrapped around a creature resembling a haunted shoelace. And somewhere inside smoky taverns beside rivers thick with fog, among exhausted fishermen, shouting merchants, muddy boots, flickering candles, and the endless smell of wood smoke and onions, hot eel pies continued emerging from ovens. Heavy. Steaming. Wrapped in crust thick enough to survive winter. The medieval world's favorite river monster dinner. Fried fish skin cracklings were the medieval world's answer to chips, pork rinds, and the unstoppable human instinct to fry absolutely anything that doesn't run away fast enough. Crispy, salty, oily, and slightly alarming to look at, these crunchy little strips turned leftover fish skin into one of the most surprisingly addictive snacks of the Middle Ages. They weren't fancy. They weren't elegant. But after a long day of hauling water, repairing fences, or trying not to die from exposure, a handful of sizzling fish cracklings probably felt like victory. The idea itself was born from pure medieval practicality. Waste not, want not. If a fish had been caught, cleaned, and cooked, nearly every part of it got used somehow. The meat went into stews and pies. Bones became broth. Heads often disappeared into pots or toward very optimistic cats. And the skin, instead of being thrown away, ended up dropped into bubbling fat where it curled, crisped, and transformed into something unexpectedly delicious. No one planned this delicacy. Some exhausted cook probably stared at a pile of fish skins one day and thought, well, it can't possibly get worse. Then it got crispy. Fish was one of the most important foods in medieval Europe, especially near rivers and coastal towns. Herring, cod, eel, perch, trout, mackerel, anything that swam slowly enough eventually landed on somebody's dinner table. Fishing villages processed huge catches daily, and with so many fish being cleaned constantly, leftover skins piled up quickly. Medieval people hated waste. Modern society throws away enormous amounts of food. Medieval society looked at leftovers and saw opportunity. Or survival. Sometimes both. If something could be boiled, salted, smoked, fried, dried, or hidden inside pastry, people found a way to eat it. Fish skins were no exception. The cooking process was brutally simple. Skins got scraped clean, sometimes salted, occasionally rubbed with herbs if someone felt ambitious, then tossed into hot fat or oil. Animal fat was more common inland, while coastal regions sometimes relied on fish oils or whatever cooking grease happened to be available that week. Then came the sound. That glorious violent sizzling. The skins shrank instantly, curling at the edges like angry leaves thrown into fire. Moisture vanished. Fat rendered out. Scales crisped. Within minutes the skins transformed from slippery scraps into crunchy golden strips smelling strongly enough to wake everyone within 3 houses. And medieval homes were not well ventilated. If you fried fish skin indoors, your walls absorbed that scent permanently. Smoke drifted through rafters while the entire building slowly adopted the aroma of aggressive seafood. Visitors entering your home days later would immediately know exactly what you've been cooking. Ah. Fish again. Yes. Still. Yes. But once cooked properly, the cracklings became strangely irresistible. Crispy. Salty. Rich with oil. Crunchy enough to echo slightly when bitten. The texture alone made them exciting because medieval diets often lacked crunch. Most foods were soft, dense, boiled, stewed, or baked into heavy forms. Cracklings shattered between your teeth with dramatic enthusiasm. They were loud food in a very quiet culinary world. And the flavor was intense. Not delicate seafood flavor either. This was concentrated ocean packed into a crisp little strip. Salty, smoky, oily, deeply savory. A single handful could make an entire room thirsty. A pinch of salt improved them even more. Garlic if available. Herbs like dill or parsley if someone had access to a garden. Wealthier cooks sometimes experimented with pepper or imported spices, turning ordinary fish skins into snacks that sounded suspiciously close to actual cuisine. Though by modern standards, they still looked like roofing material. The practical benefits mattered just as much as taste. Fried fish skins lasted longer than fresh fish meat, especially when salted heavily. They traveled well. Stayed edible for days. Packed enormous amounts of fat and calories into lightweight portions. That made them perfect for medieval workers. Farmers carried them into fields. Fishermen ate them on boats. Laborers stuffed them into pockets beside chunks of bread and onions. Soldiers marching across muddy roads appreciated anything crunchy that didn't spoil immediately. Sailors especially relied on preserved foods like cracklings during long voyages. Life at sea was already miserable enough without bland food. Ships smelled terrible, fresh water grew stale quickly, and storms regularly tried to murder everyone on board. A crispy salty snack probably improved morale dramatically. At least until somebody spilled fish oil on rope again. Taverns also sold fish cracklings as cheap snacks alongside ale. This was medieval bar food at its finest. Salty enough to encourage more drinking. Cheap enough for ordinary workers. Loud enough to cut through drunken conversations. You can almost hear it. Crowded tavern. Smoke hanging thick in the air. Ale splashing onto rough wooden tables. Somebody arguing loudly near the fire. And nearby, a man chewing fish cracklings with the acoustic force of collapsing timber. Medieval eating was not subtle. Street vendors sometimes sold fried fish skins wrapped in scraps of cloth or paper to passing crowds during markets and festivals. The smell alone drew people in. Entire streets could fill with sizzling smoke while vendors shouted over one another trying to sell snacks before they cooled. Of course, quality varied enormously. Freshly fried cracklings tasted wonderful. Old cracklings tasted like punishment. Humidity ruined crispness quickly. Poor storage turned crunchy fish skin into leathery sadness. Some batches remained suspiciously chewy no matter how long they cooked. Others contained scales sharp enough to remind diners that fish are technically armored. Still, people ate them happily. Because medieval standards for snacks were built around survival first and elegance somewhere around 19th place. And honestly, compared to some medieval foods, fish cracklings were relatively civilized. This was an era producing eel pies, blood puddings, fermented fish sauces, and cheeses powerful enough to emotionally affect nearby livestock. Crunchy fried fish skin barely registered as strange. Children probably loved them too, mostly because crunchy foods are universally entertaining. Though they likely also burned their fingers constantly by grabbing skins too early from cooling trays. Some lessons transcend history. Religious fasting traditions also increased fish consumption enormously throughout medieval Europe. On many church-designated days, people avoided meat entirely and relied heavily on fish instead. This created huge demand for seafood products and encouraged creative ways of using every single edible piece. Which meant more fish skins. Which meant more cracklings. Monasteries likely made their own versions too. Medieval monks were surprisingly practical cooks when necessary. If fish skins remained after preparing meals, somebody eventually experimented with frying them. Quiet monastery corridors probably smelled incredible and horrifying at the same time. There was also something deeply satisfying about turning scraps into comfort food. Medieval life demanded resilience. Winters were harsh. Harvests failed. Food insecurity hovered constantly over ordinary families. Waste became unacceptable because every calorie mattered. So when discarded fish skin transformed into something delicious, it felt almost magical. A little victory over scarcity. And unlike softer foods, cracklings carried personality. They snapped loudly. Curled into strange shapes. Left fingers oily. sometimes got stuck between teeth with the determination of medieval bureaucracy. But they were memorable. You didn't absent-mindedly eat fried fish skin. You experienced it. The smell announced itself first. Then came the crunch. Then the salt. Then the rich oily aftertaste lingering long enough to make you immediately reach for ale or watered wine. And somehow, despite every reason they should have been terrible, they worked. That's the strange brilliance of medieval food sometimes. It wasn't refined. It wasn't pretty. But it understood hunger completely. People needed food that lasted. Food that filled stomachs. Food that used every available resource. Food capable of surviving travel, labor, weather, and occasional accidents involving livestock. Fish cracklings checked every box. And somewhere along windy coastlines, beside crowded fish markets and smoky taverns, in kitchens blackened by years of fire and salt air, pans of bubbling oil continued transforming slippery scraps into crunchy little treasures. Salty. Crispy. Smelling powerful enough to summon seagulls from neighboring kingdoms. Bread soaked in ale was the medieval solution to two very common problems. Bread too hard to chew and ale too questionable to drink confidently on its own. Instead of throwing either away, medieval people combined them together and created something that was technically a meal, emotionally a compromise, and spiritually the exact flavor of surviving winter. Known in different places as sops, ale bread, or trench toast, this dish was one of the simplest comfort foods of the Middle Ages. It required no rare ingredients, no expensive spices, and very little dignity. Just stale bread, a bowl of ale. And the willingness to believe that soaking one disappointing thing in another disappointing thing might somehow improve both. And strangely enough, it worked. In medieval Europe, bread was everywhere. People ate it daily, constantly, and in quantities modern bakeries can only dream about. Rich or poor, nearly every meal involved bread in some form. Fresh bread was wonderful, soft and warm from the oven, smelling like life briefly had meaning. But fresh bread never lasted long. By the next day, most loaves had already begun their transformation into compact medieval weaponry. Bread hardened quickly in the dry air of smoky kitchens and cold stone homes. Some loaves became so dense you could probably defend property with them. Throwing bread away, however, was unthinkable. Grain took too much labor to grow, harvest, grind, and bake. Waste was unacceptable. So medieval people got creative. If bread became too hard to chew comfortably, you soaked it. Water worked. Broth worked better. But ale? Ale turned stale bread into an actual meal. And ale was everywhere too. Not modern beer with polished branding and notes of citrus harvested under moonlight. Medieval ale was rough, cloudy, low in alcohol, and brewed in kitchens, monasteries, and back rooms with equipment that would make modern health inspectors collapse dramatically onto the floor. But it was safer than water much of the time. Clean drinking water was not guaranteed in medieval towns. Wells became contaminated easily. Rivers carried waste. Ale, even weak ale, underwent boiling during brewing, making it more reliable for daily consumption. Children drank it. Workers drank it. Monks drank it. Entire villages basically operated on a steady background level of fermented grain. Which meant there was always ale available for soaking bread. The process itself could not have been simpler. Take a chunk of stale bread, preferably something sturdy enough not to dissolve immediately. Drop it into warm ale. Wait while the bread slowly absorbed liquid like an exhausted sponge reconsidering its purpose in life. The transformation was dramatic. Hard bread softened into thick, warm mush carrying the earthy bitterness of grain and fermentation. The ale soaked deep into every crack while steam rose gently from bowls near the fire. Suddenly yesterday's stale loaf became dinner again. Or breakfast. Or both. Medieval meal schedules were flexible when survival entered the conversation. Working people especially depended on dishes like this because they needed calories quickly. Farmers, blacksmiths, laborers, fishermen, servants. These people burned enormous energy every day through physical work. Food didn't need elegance. It needed weight. Bread soaked in ale delivered exactly that. Warm. Filling. Cheap. Soft enough not to crack teeth. Honestly, by medieval standards, this counted as luxury. Sometimes cooks added extras if fortune smiled briefly upon the household. A little cheese melted over the top. Chopped onions. Herbs from the garden. Maybe a fried egg if the chickens were productive and nobody else claimed it first. On feast days, wealthier households occasionally used spiced ale flavored with cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, or honey. This elevated the dish from survival porridge to survival porridge with ambition. Though medieval spice use could become intense. Some cooks added enough nutmeg to make the entire bowl smell like a festive furniture shop. Still, people appreciated any flavor variation available during long winters dominated by salted foods and repetitive meals. The texture of ale-soaked bread deserves special attention because it existed in a strange category somewhere between soup, pudding, and controlled collapse. Good sops held their shape slightly while remaining soft enough to eat with a spoon. Bad sops became a bowl of fermented paste vaguely resembling regret. Timing mattered enormously. Leave the bread too dry and you risked chewing something with the consistency of roof tiles. Leave it soaking too long and suddenly dinner transformed into swamp pudding. Medieval cooks walked that line carefully. And despite how odd it sounds today, people genuinely enjoyed it. Because warm soaked bread beside a fire on a freezing evening felt comforting. Medieval homes were often cold, damp, smoky places. Winter winds crept through wooden walls and under doors. Simple warm foods carried emotional weight beyond their ingredients. A bowl of ale bread meant rest. It meant sitting down after hours of labor. It meant warmth in your stomach. It meant not being hungry tonight. That mattered. Travelers ate versions of soaked bread too. Inns served simple bowls to guests arriving exhausted from muddy roads and miserable weather. Pilgrims crossing long distances needed inexpensive meals that restored energy without requiring elaborate preparation. Bread and ale accomplished that beautifully. Monasteries likely prepared similar dishes regularly. Monks brewed ale constantly and baked enormous amounts of bread, meaning leftover ingredients naturally became soups, puddings, and soaked meals. Medieval kitchens specialized in stretching food as far as possible. Nothing wasted. Everything reused. Even disappointment got repurposed creatively. Some noble households developed more refined versions using wine instead of ale. This was where medieval food began pretending to be sophisticated. Sops in wine involved toasted bread soaked in warm sweetened wine often flavored with spices and occasionally thickened into something almost dessert-like. Nobles treated it as elegant dining. Everyone else quietly observed that rich people had essentially invented alcoholic bread pudding and were acting very proud about it. Still, it smelled wonderful. Mulled wine drifting through candlelit halls while toasted bread softened slowly into fragrant sweetness probably felt deeply luxurious after heavy feasts full of roasted meat and greasy stew. Texture remained questionable though. Some versions became velvety and rich. Others resembled damp cushions floating in wine. Medieval dining accepted a broader range of textures than modern people generally tolerate emotionally. Taverns served rougher ale-soaked bread to workers late at night. Thick chunks floating in wooden bowls beside candles and spilled beer while drunk customers argued loudly nearby. This was practical food for practical people. Nobody ordered it for visual presentation. No medieval cook carefully placed microgreens on top while describing notes of toasted grain. The dish existed because hunger existed and stale bread needed solving. And honestly, there's something admirable about that. Medieval food culture excelled at adaptation. Hard bread became soup. Old ale flavored meals. Leftovers transformed into breakfast. Nothing disappeared if it still contained calories. Even poor households could usually manage some version of soaked bread because the ingredients were common. That made it comforting across social classes. Rich or poor, most people understood the simple relief of warm bread softened enough to eat comfortably after a long day. Children probably loved softer versions too, especially during cold months when hot meals became precious. Elderly people benefited as well since chewing hard bread with medieval teeth could quickly become a dangerous adventure. Ale bread solved problems quietly. Though it absolutely did not travel well. This was not portable food. Freshly soaked bread needed immediate eating before texture collapsed entirely. Leave it sitting too long and the bread entered horrifying territory somewhere between sponge and mud. The bowl slowly transformed into a sad edible metaphor for lost ambition. You ate quickly or accepted consequences. Still, despite all its humble simplicity, bread soaked in ale survived for centuries because it answered basic human needs remarkably well. Warmth, fullness, comfort, practicality. And somewhere inside smoky cottages lit by firelight, while rain tapped softly against shutters and exhausted workers loosened muddy boots near the hearth, bowls of ale-soaked bread continued steaming gently beside rough wooden tables. Soft. Warm. Just bitter enough to remind you life was real. The medieval world's favorite way to rescue stale bread from becoming building material. Sops in wine were what happened when the medieval upper class looked at bread and thought, this would be far more elegant if it were floating in alcohol. Somewhere between dessert, late-night snack, and culinary experiment, this strangely refined dish became a favorite among nobles who had already eaten far too much and still wanted one final course to prove they possessed both wealth and questionable judgment. The concept itself was deceptively simple. Take bread, preferably toasted or at least not old enough to qualify as roofing material, and soak it in wine. Not ordinary wine either. Medieval nobles preferred wine warmed with honey, spices, and occasionally enough cinnamon to make the entire dining hall smell like a festive candle shop. Once the bread softened properly, the dish became something soft, rich, fragrant, and technically edible with a spoon. Nobles called it sophisticated. Everyone else quietly noticed it was alcoholic toast soup. Still, sops in wine became surprisingly popular at banquets, feasts, winter gatherings, and those painfully long aristocratic dinners where nobody wanted to mention politics, inheritance disputes, or the fact someone's cousin had recently tried to poison somebody again. Instead, guests sat beside candlelight sipping wine while politely chewing soaked bread and pretending this was the height of civilization. And honestly, by medieval standards, it kind of was. Bread and wine already held enormous importance throughout medieval Europe. Bread formed the foundation of nearly every meal regardless of class. Rich people ate fine white loaves while poorer families relied on darker, rougher breads packed with rye or barley. But everyone ate bread constantly. Entire meals revolved around it. Wine, meanwhile, represented refinement. Ale belonged to workers and taverns. Wine belonged to nobles, wealthy merchants, bishops, and anyone eager to look important while holding goblets dramatically near fireplaces. Imported wines from France, Italy, or Spain carried prestige. Sweet wines especially became symbols of luxury because sweetness itself was expensive. Naturally, medieval cooks decided to combine these two essentials together. The preparation varied from household to household. Some kitchens lightly toasted slices before soaking them so the bread retained a bit of structure. Others used softer bread immediately, creating dishes closer to pudding. Wealthier versions included honey, saffron, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, or sugar imported at alarming expense from distant trade routes. Every added spice quietly screamed money. A noble serving heavily spiced wine sops might as well stand up and announce, "Observe how financially irresponsible I can afford to be." And guests appreciated it. Because medieval banquets were theatrical experiences. Food existed partly to nourish people and partly to display wealth, status, and access to rare ingredients. Tables overflowed with roasted meats, pies stuffed with birds, sweet pastries, preserved fruits, sugared nuts, and goblets of wine flowing endlessly until everyone either became cheerful or started making dangerous political observations. Sops in wine usually arrive toward the end of these meals. A warm comforting dish after heavy meats and thick stews. The softened bread absorbed rich wine flavors while spices drifted upward in fragrant steam. Eaten slowly with spoons, the dish created a surprisingly cozy finish to chaotic feasting. At least when done correctly. Because there was a very thin line between luxurious wine dessert and wet bread mistake. Timing mattered enormously. Too little soaking and the bread remained stubbornly dry in the center like edible betrayal. Too much soaking and the entire bowl collapsed into wine-colored mush resembling something accidentally discovered at the bottom of a barrel. Texture became everything. Good sops balanced softness with structure. The bread held together just enough to feel intentional. Bad sops slid around bowls sadly while guests pretended not to notice. No amount of cinnamon could fully rescue badly soaked bread. Though medieval cooks absolutely tried. Spices covered many sins in medieval cuisine. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, mace, ginger. These ingredients flavored expensive dishes partly because they tasted exciting and partly because they distracted people from asking difficult questions about freshness. Fortunately, wine sops usually involved relatively safe ingredients. Mostly. The wine itself ranged wildly in quality. Some noble households imported excellent vintages. Others served wine that had spent questionable amounts of time aging inside wooden barrels beside damp cellar walls. Sweetening the wine with honey or sugar helped enormously. So did warming it over fire with fragrant spices until guests became too comfortable to criticize details. Warm wine changed everything. Cold wine sops felt sad. Warm wine sops felt luxurious. Especially during winter feasts when cold winds rattled castle shutters and enormous halls smelled of smoke, roasting meat, damp wool, and beeswax candles. Sitting beside the fire with a bowl of warm spiced wine and softened bread probably felt deeply comforting after hours of loud feasting. The dish also carried a strangely emotional quality. Unlike roasted meats or elaborate pies meant to impress visually, sops in wine felt personal. Soft. Quiet. Something eaten slowly after the excitement of the meal faded. Almost medieval comfort food for people wearing velvet sleeves and discussing land disputes. And medieval nobles genuinely needed comfort sometimes. Castle life was colder and less glamorous than modern imagination likes to believe. Stone walls trapped dampness. Fires smoked constantly. Winters stretched endlessly. Political tension hovered over many gatherings like invisible fog. A warm sweet dish at the end of dinner carried real appeal. Children of noble households likely loved sweeter versions too, especially when cooks added honey or dried fruits. Though serving wine to children was completely normal by medieval standards, usually watered down and weak compared to adult servings. Nobody considered this strange. The Middle Ages had entirely different priorities. Some versions of wine sops bordered on dessert while others resembled breakfast foods. Morning versions occasionally used lighter wine or mixed in milk, creating softer dishes easier to eat early in the day. Wealthy households with access to sugar experimented constantly with sweeter preparations. Poorer people rarely enjoyed such elaborate versions because wine itself cost money. Ale-soaked bread remained the more common working-class equivalent. But even ordinary households occasionally made simple wine sops during festivals or holidays if they could spare ingredients. Which shows something timeless about human behavior. Give people bread and alcohol long enough and eventually someone turns it into pudding. The presentation mattered too. Wealthy feasts loved appearance. Silver bowls, carved wooden spoons, decorative goblets. A dish of wine sops might arrive sprinkled with extra spice or dotted with raisins and nuts for texture. Though underneath all the decoration, it remained soaked bread. Very fancy soaked bread. But still soaked bread. And honestly, there's something admirable about medieval cuisine embracing that reality completely. No obsession with perfection. No concern for modern aesthetics. If warm wine and soft bread tasted comforting, that was enough reason for the dish to exist. Even if it occasionally resembled a culinary accident. Late-night feasts especially suited wine sops perfectly. After hours of drinking, music, storytelling, and overeating, guests wanted something gentle before bed. Rich roasted foods became exhausting eventually. A warm bowl of spiced wine bread settled the stomach while extending the evening slightly longer. Or at least giving everyone something to do besides argue about inheritance again. Musicians probably played softly nearby while servants cleared trenchers and goblets from crowded tables. Candles burned low. Fires crackled against stone hearths. Somewhere in the hall, a noble carefully spooned wine-soaked bread into their mouth while pretending this counted as restraint after consuming half a roasted goose earlier. Medieval elegance operated differently. And somewhere inside torchlit castles filled with smoke, laughter, political tension, barking dogs under tables, and the endless smell of wine and roasted meat, bowls of sops and wine continued appearing quietly at the ends of feasts. Soft. Sweet. Slightly intoxicating. Balanced delicately between luxury dessert and edible misunderstanding. There was something strangely magical about dried fruit in the medieval world. Tiny wrinkled bundles of sweetness tucked away in clay jars, monastery cupboards, merchant wagons, and the deep pockets of people hoping nobody noticed they'd stolen an extra fig from the feast table. Long before candy shops or chocolate boxes existed, dried fruit was one of the few treats capable of making medieval people stop chewing boiled turnips for a moment and think, ah. Life may actually be worth continuing. It looked unimpressive, of course. Raisins resembled old pebbles. Dates looked vaguely suspicious. Figs had the texture of enchanted bark. But appearances meant very little in the Middle Ages. What mattered was that these strange little fruits were sweet, portable, and capable of surviving long journeys without turning into soup. And in medieval Europe, that was practically wizardry. Fresh fruit spoiled quickly. One warm afternoon too many and your beautiful harvest transformed into a buzzing tragedy surrounded by flies and disappointment. Drying fruit solved that problem beautifully. Remove the moisture, shrink the fruit into chewy little nuggets, and suddenly you had food that could survive winter, trade routes, and possibly several crusades. The process itself was wonderfully simple. Fruit sat beneath the sun, near ovens, or above smoky fires until the water slowly disappeared. Grapes became raisins. Plums became prunes. Figs shriveled into dense chewy discs that looked ancient even when freshly made. Dates arrived already suspiciously sticky from warmer climates farther south and east. The result was sweet. Intensely sweet. Modern people forget how shocking sweetness once felt. Medieval diets leaned heavily toward bread, onions, cabbage, ale, and salted meats. Dessert was not a daily expectation. So biting into a raisin packed with concentrated sugar probably felt like briefly tasting another dimension. Children loved dried fruit instantly. Mostly because medieval childhood contained very few joyful snacks that didn't also involve chores, religion, or accidental splinters. Raisins stuck in teeth with terrifying dedication. Figs came loaded with crunchy seeds that found every possible gap in your gums. Dates practically glued your mouth shut after 2 bites. Eating dried fruit quietly was impossible. Every chew sounded thoughtful and slightly dangerous. But nobody cared. Because sweetness forgave many crimes. Wealthy nobles especially adored dried fruit because imported figs, dates, and raisins carried status. Merchant ships hauled them across seas while caravans carried them through dusty trade routes stretching toward the Middle East and Mediterranean. Serving exotic dried fruit at feasts quietly announced that your household had money, connections, and access to foods peasants could only stare at respectfully from across the table. Naturally, medieval cooks began putting dried fruit into everything. Honey cakes received raisins. Porridge gained chopped dates. Meat pies occasionally hid figs inside like tiny sugary surprises waiting to confuse unsuspecting dinner guests. Rich households soaked dried fruits in wine, drizzled them with rose water, or baked them into pastries elaborate enough to require several servants and at least one emotional breakdown in the kitchen. Because medieval cooking believed subtlety was weakness. Poorer families rarely saw large amounts of dried fruit, but when they did, it became an event. A wedding. A holiday. A feast day. Someone's successful return from travel. Tiny handfuls divided carefully while children watched like hawks calculating fairness. And medieval people absolutely remembered who got the extra fig. Storage made dried fruit even more valuable. Fresh fruit spoiled quickly. Dried fruit lasted months. Kept inside cloth sacks, wooden chests, or clay jars, it survived winters beautifully. Travelers carried it. Monks stored it. Sailors packed it beside hard bread and smoked fish during long voyages. Though over time, the fruit hardened dramatically. Some raisins eventually achieved the density of decorative gravel. Dates fused into sticky clusters requiring upper body strength to separate. Old figs became chewy enough to qualify as character-building exercises. Still edible though. Usually. And somewhere inside smoky kitchens filled with crackling fires, buzzing flies, damp boots, and the smell of bread baking slowly beside the hearth, little bowls of dried fruit continued appearing quietly on medieval tables. And finally, we arrive at the last great food in the strange, greasy adventure that was medieval junk food. Fried eel. A snack so wildly suspicious looking that it feels less like dinner and more like a dare someone lost near a swamp. After candied fennel seeds that freshened your breath while threatening your teeth. After honey cakes dense enough to survive natural disasters. After fish skin cracklings that smelled strong enough to summon seagulls from neighboring kingdoms. After stale bread soaked in ale because medieval people apparently feared wasting food more than sadness itself. There was fried eel. Crispy. Greasy. Slightly horrifying. The final boss of medieval snacks. Imagine pulling dinner out of a swamp at midnight. That was eel fishing. Long, writhing, shiny creatures slithering through shallow water like enchanted shoelaces possessed by centuries of bad intentions. Honestly, who saw the first eel and decided to eat it? Was someone extremely hungry? Very brave? Recently hit on the head with farm equipment? We may never know. But medieval people loved them. Because once fried, eel transformed from absolutely not into, wait, hold on, this is actually incredible. First came the catching. Usually at night, with baskets, nets, or bare hands if someone felt unusually confident in their life choices. Eels didn't go quietly either. They twisted, snapped, and launched themselves around like muscular wet ropes trying to escape taxes. Then came skinning them. And this was where dignity officially left the room. Preparing eel looked less like cooking and more like losing a fight with haunted leather. The thing slipped everywhere. Tables got slimy. Cooks got angry. Somewhere in medieval Europe, at least one exhausted kitchen worker absolutely yelled, "Why are you still moving?" But once the ordeal ended, the reward was surprisingly worth it. The eel got chopped into pieces, rubbed with herbs or salt if available, then tossed into bubbling fat over the fire. And suddenly the kitchen smelled amazing. Rich, oily, savory. The skin crisped beautifully while the inside stayed soft and tender. Kind of like if fried fish and roasted chicken had a very confusing child. And people ate it everywhere. Peasants loved it because eels were cheap and plentiful. Nobles loved it because apparently no banquet was complete without at least one dish that looked vaguely cursed. Monks ate it during religious fasts because technically eel counted as fish, even though it looked like something that whispered secrets from riverbanks after dark. Honestly, medieval food laws were doing their best. Fried eel showed up at fairs, taverns, roadside inns, and giant feasts where kings stuffed them into pies and served them dramatically to guests. Imagine sitting at dinner and someone walks in carrying a giant steaming pastry filled with river snakes. Would you eat it? Medieval people absolutely would. Now yes, there were problems. Bones. So many bones. Tiny hidden bones waiting patiently to ruin your confidence. And occasionally the eel still twitched after cooking, which probably made dinner feel unnecessarily personal. But once you bit through that crispy skin into the rich salty meat underneath, suddenly none of that mattered anymore. Because for one glorious greasy moment, life was good. Weird. But good. If you asked someone in Elizabethan England to explain what witchcraft was, you would receive a very clear and familiar description. Witches were, as everyone at that time knew, devil-worshipping practitioners of black magic. They meet in covens, fly on broomsticks, consort with devils, perform satanic rituals, make human sacrifices, and cast evil spells and curses. It is tempting to believe that this definition of witchcraft is as old as Christianity itself. But it's not. If you were to describe a witch in that way to anyone living in 1300, they would have been utterly shocked. It would have been entirely unfamiliar and new to them. You might even have been accused of being mad. The truth is that the idea of the witch, as we know it today, was invented in the late Middle Ages. But how and why did this happen? If I were to ask you to describe a witch, what image comes most easily to mind? Your first thought would probably be of an older woman, perhaps a hag. She probably lives alone to give her the privacy she needs to practice her dark arts. Images of black magic, devil worship, covens, black Sabbaths, black cats, broomsticks, human sacrifices and orgies might spring to mind. This detailed image of the witch was fully formed by Elizabethan times and persists to today. But, in 1300, it simply did not register in the cultural consciousness. In the two crucial centuries between 1300 and 1500 the concept of the witch was invented. The idea of witchcraft and sorcery certainly existed in 1300, as indeed it had for centuries, but it was far more loosely defined. It was not particularly associated with devil worship. Concepts such as witch marks and black Sabbaths were unheard of. When people thought of witches and sorcery, they were no more likely to think of women than of men. Indeed, the practice of magic was by no means automatically associated with anything inherently evil or harmful. Throughout Middle Ages, it might perhaps surprise you to learn that very few witches were actively persecuted. Certainly, the numbers involved were vanishingly small compared to the great witch hunts of the late 16th and early 17th century. True enough, the Bible itself contains some firm prescriptions against sorcery and witchcraft. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. You shall not practice augury or witchcraft. A man or a woman who is a medium, or who has familiar spirits, shall surely be put to death. But wait. The references to witches and witchcraft come from English translations of the Bible. These are all influenced by the King James Bible, which was compiled in the early c. at the height of the early modern witch hunts. In the Latin translation, used during the Middle Ages, the word witch is not used. Instead, we find maleficos, which specifically means practitioners of harmful magic, not witches in general. Additionally, nothing in the Bible explicitly links witches with any kind of Satanist cult. For most of the Middle Ages the official church position was that sorcery and witchcraft were viewed as misguided and to be discouraged. However, they were not seen as inherently evil, and they certainly did not warrant active persecution. In fact, magic of various kinds was quite commonly practiced in the Middle Ages. If the early medieval church had imposed the death penalty on everyone dabbling in magic it would have led to a bloodbath. It would certainly have turned the pagan populations who the early missionaries were attempting to convert, against the faith. The church saw magic as a misguided superstitious belief, much the same attitude as many people have today. Since this magic did not come from God, as far as the church was concerned, it could not work. People could be deceived into such foolishness by demons, but this did not mean they worshipped demons. The practice of magic was usually seen as no more than a symptom of pagan or heretical belief. The solution was therefore to stamp out paganism and heresy. The official church teaching, for most of the Middle Ages, was that those who practiced magic were delusional and foolish rather than evil. The relationship between medieval society and magic was therefore ambivalent. On the one hand, there is no denying that the church disapproved of it. But on the other, the church saw no need to proactively persecute it. Of course, not all supernatural powers were classed as magic anyway. Miracles, visions, prophecy, and holy relics were all gifts from God. Deciding what exactly qualified as magic in the medieval mind was not so clear-cut as we might think. Astrology provides a form of divination or augury not unlike prophecy. So does this count as sorcery or witchcraft? Or is it another gift from God? Is not astrology simply observing the patterns in the heavens and discerning their meaning? Are not the stars in the heavens the work of God Himself? So, is not astrology simply a means of foretelling the future through an understanding of God's work? Certainly, many people in medieval Europe believed so. If you were lucky enough to attend university, you'd certainly be taught astrology as part of your education. And how about casting spells? If they are aimed at healing, or encouraging a good harvest, that is clearly not evil. It may be misguided, even foolish, but not evil in and of itself. Only if you tried to use magic to curse someone or create some evil effect could it be considered evil. This form of magic, as medieval folk would see it, was classified as maleficent. And practicing this kind of magic would make you maleficos. Magic was practiced openly by many people in the Middle Ages. However, magical practice cannot be regarded as a homogeneous collection of beliefs. Some within the literate elite formally studied magic and magical rituals. Their interest could range from casual curiosity to a serious practitioner. This form of magic required a degree of literacy since its rites and spells were learnt from books. These books represented a collection of medieval and classical spells and rituals. And, during the Crusades, other magical works were imported from Middle Eastern cultures. Practitioners of this form of magic could and did perform rituals to summon and control demons. They argued that this was not devil worship since they controlled and commanded these demons rather than venerated them. They also argued that, since they used their magic for good, this was not evil. However, the type of magic practiced by illiterate commoners was of a different sort. This form of magic represented folk traditions handed down orally from generation to generation. Typically, such magic encompassed simple charms, herbalism, crop blessings, fertility spells and so on. Its practitioners regarded magic of this kind as a traditional part of their local culture. Neither form of magic was automatically regarded as maleficent, nor viewed as evidence of devil worship for most of the medieval period. In fact, a far greater fear gripped the medieval church than witchcraft or sorcery. The great enemy was not witchcraft but heresy. Heretical groups were organized in a way that witches and sorcerers were not. They preached dangerous doctrines that posed a direct, and often overt, threat to church authority. Witches, by contrast, were simply not seen as representing any kind of organized, insidious, or diabolic threat. Indeed, the official policy of church inquisitions, right up until the early 14th century, was to ignore witchcraft unless heresy was involved. Heretics were a very different story. Certain heretical sects were very real and very clearly involved many people who opposed the church. Perhaps the most dangerous example of this had been the Cathars, who flourished in southern France during the C12th and C13th. A common accusation made against heretics was that they had been misled by demons or the devil. Satan was, after all, the great deceiver. For this reason, persecution of heresy would often attract accusations of demon worship, secret satanic rituals, and the practice of maleficent magic. This featured in the accusations leveled against the Templars in the early 14th century. However, the primary charge always remained one of heresy, not witchcraft. For most of the Middle Ages, the practice of sorcery was only condemned if it was deemed to be maleficent. However, scholastic thinking during the 13th and 14th century was increasingly concerned to discourage the practice of magic. To do this, a sound theological case had to be made to condemn it. The sorcerer's argument that commanding a devil was not devil worship was one of the concepts that needed to be successfully refuted. This was done by pointing out the fact that to trick a demon into serving the sorcerer, some form of lure was often offered. This could be blood or the sacrifice of an animal. This would attract the demon, which could then be bound and commanded. However, by offering the demon something such as blood, was this not a kind of transaction? Was it not, in effect, a pact? This argument facilitated a blanket condemnation of sorcerous demonology. However, it also had the effect of strengthening the association between sorcery and devil worship. The early persecutions of sorcerers and witches focused mainly on practitioners of ritual magic, where demonology was most likely to be involved. However, these early persecutions, pre-1330, were primarily of a political nature. A good early example was the trial of Dame Alice Keitler in Ireland in 1324/5. The motive for her persecution was almost certainly political. During her trial she was accused of maleficia. Not simply practicing magic but practicing bad magic. She was also accused of belonging to a secret heretic sect. The accusation of heresy is significant. Since the Church still taught that witches were not worth prosecuting unless heresy was involved. The case against Alice included several accusations that were commonly made against heretics. Many of these echoed the indictments against the Templars nearly 20 years before. The prosecutors alleged that the heretics met in secret, denied the cross, made sacrifices to demons and engaged in lewd sexual acts. They were even accused of brewing evil potions from the clothing of dead babies. The concept of the witch, as we understand it, is present here, but only in an embryonic form. A classic case of how accusations of sorcery could be used for political ends is that of Duchess Eleanor Cobham. She was accused of consulting various astrologers who predicted an illness would afflict the young King Henry VI in 1441. Eleanor denied her involvement but admitted procuring magic potions, which she claimed were to help her conceive, from one Marjorie Germain. Germain was a well-known witch, frequently consulted by several members of the nobility of that time, of whom only Eleanor was accused of any wrongdoing. Eleanor, Marjorie, and several of Eleanor's associates were charged with treasonable necromancy. Those of lesser rank all met grisly ends but Eleanor herself escaped death. However, she was forced to divorce her husband and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was also made to do penance by walking barefoot between 3 churches. Her prosecution clearly had a strong political dimension. Her husband had several powerful political enemies who were itching for an opportunity to see his influence curbed. Eleanor's conviction was therefore a major blow to his reputation and authority. Had Eleanor not been the wife of such a political heavyweight, it is unlikely her dabbling in the world of magic would have been so vigorously prosecuted. Until 1330, prosecution without some political motive was rare. However, these early cases served to establish the precedent that at least some witches and sorcerers could and should be persecuted. By the mid-14th century persecution without any obvious political motive began to become more common. Accusations of devil worship, pacts with demons and/or secret conspiracies to perform acts of maleficence also became more common. The net began to widen from the obvious targets, scholarly sorcerers who openly engaged in demon summoning, to others. Most ritual sorcerers were men, but a much higher proportion of folk magic practitioners were women. This transition, inevitably, led to an increasing association between women and witchcraft. By the late 14th century, the association between witchcraft and devil worship had become much stronger. It now appeared far more frequently in accusations made against witches and sorcerers. The first systematic witch hunt on any scale began in Valais, in Switzerland, in 1428. Here a total of 367 witches were hunted down and killed over 8 years. Most people targeted, even by this time, were still male. Accusations included not only witchcraft but also murder and, still, heresy. Even by this stage society found it hard to conceive of a conspiracy of witches unless some underlying heretical belief lay at the heart of it. The result of Nider's research was Formicarius, written sometime between 1435 and 1437. In it he argued that witches were not simply people who practiced magic. They were, in every case, also guilty of renouncing their faith, trampling on the cross and selling their souls to the devil. Nider was also keen to draw attention to this practice amongst the more common folk, especially amongst women. It was, Nider argued, a more common and serious problem than people imagined. Formicarius was quite shocking and represented completely new thinking to many. Nider's insistence on directly linking devil worship with witchcraft and his emphasis on female witches were both new developments. Despite this, Nider did not advocate mass witch hunts. He personally believed that church reform and adherence to traditional monastic rites were the correct antidote to witchcraft, not burning people. Whatever the intentions of scholars like Nider, a paranoid fear of witchcraft was beginning to infect the public consciousness. By the middle of the 15th century, it was reaching fever pitch. In 1453, in the village of Marmande in France, local people blamed an epidemic of an unknown disease on maleficent sorcery. Initially the authorities accused a single local woman of being the witch responsible. However, the locals, fearing there were other maleficent witches in their midst, took the law into their own hands. In the end a couple of dozen alleged witches, all women, were seized by the mob. These unfortunates were then tortured to extract confessions. 2 died under torture and any who confessed were burnt at the stake. The idea that a community might be threatened, not just by one witch, but by a secret conspiracy, or coven, of witches was now taking shape. Heinrich Kramer was a Dominican church inquisitor living in the late c. Kramer held a particular obsession with the dangers of witchcraft. He was convinced that witchcraft posed a far greater threat than the church was willing to accept. In 1484 he persuaded the Pope to issue a papal bull authorizing him to extend his inquisitorial work to investigate witchcraft anywhere in Germany. Despite this, senior German clerics remained skeptical of Kramer's obsession. Whilst investigating witchcraft in Innsbruck, Kramer clashed with a wealthy local woman by the name of Helena Stubberin. She concluded that Kramer was hell-bent on persecuting innocent people and whipping up hysteria. She even went so far as to publicly disrupt his sermons. Kramer put her and half a dozen other women on trial for witchcraft. Whilst interrogating Helena, Kramer's questioning focused obsessively on her alleged promiscuity and lascivious sexual behavior. Fortunately for Stubberin, Kramer's immediate superior, Bishop George Golser, did not share his zeal. Golser increasingly came to regard Kramer's accusations as baseless, bordering on unhinged. Eventually Golser lost patience and shut down the trials in 1486. He decided Kramer was unstable and paranoid, and duly expelled him from Innsbruck. Kramer was thwarted but not deterred. He clearly could not continue his witch hunt in Innsbruck. However, what he could do was write a book to promote his views on witchcraft. He joined forces with another fanatical cleric, Jacob Sprenger, and the result of their combined effort was finally published in 1487. Although both men are credited as co-authors, Kramer was clearly the principal driving force behind the book. Malleus Maleficarum, as it was titled, added very little that was genuinely new to how many people viewed witches by this time. However, what it did do, very effectively, was create a cohesive, comprehensive, account of the most radical views on witchcraft in circulation at the time. Malleus, for all its radicalism, was still constrained by official church canon law, however much Kramer and Sprenger may have wished otherwise. In particular, the official position of the church was still that magic, if it was even real at all, was an illusion or deception of Satan. It was not real since Satan had no power to influence God's creation directly. Despite this, the book argued that magic should not be entirely dismissed as delusional. Unable to directly contradict canon law, Malleus instead took the view that whilst magic could often be a delusion or a deception, this was not always the case. The devil was real enough, and magic that derived from him could also surely be real if God permitted it as a test of the faithful. It is a most certain and most Catholic opinion that there are sorcerers and witches who by the help of the devil, on account of a compact which they have entered into with him, are able, since God allows this, to produce real and actual evils and harm. Malleus also emphasized the point, again, already believed by a significant number of people, that the power to perform magic comes exclusively from the devil. Therefore, everyone who performs magic must have made some kind of pact with the devil. Prior to Malleus, many people still believed that the practice of magic was only evil if there was evil intent. However, Malleus did much to confirm and reinforce the view that witchcraft was always, fundamentally, a manifestation of Satanism. Malleus also argued that witches are recruited mainly by other witches, rather than directly by Satan. The implication of this was clearly that where you find one witch, you will likely find a network of witches. The book did not elaborate in detail on such things as the Black Sabbath. However, it did much to promote the opinion that witches were joined together in a secret satanic conspiracy. One of the most important effects of Malleus comes from the fact that it was stridently misogynistic. Whilst it was not unique in displaying misogynistic attitudes, it was especially virulent and detailed in its insistence that witchcraft was primarily a female evil. It argued, more forcefully than any previous treatise, that most witches were women. The text included many detailed and lurid elaborations on the vices of women. It even accused female witches of mutilating men by cutting off and collecting their genitals. A greater number of witches is found in the fragile feminine sex than among men. It is indeed a fact that it is idle to contradict, since it is accredited by actual experience, apart from the verbal testimony of credible witnesses. All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable, wherefore for the sake of fulfilling their lusts they consort even with devils.